I kept a cartoon on my desk for many years. I eventually lost it. But the cartoon showed a pastor fiercely preaching with intensity. And there was a thought bubble, above his head to see what he was thinking. And the thought bubble had a general. And he had a sword in his hand, and he was calling the army to charge into battle. And over the congregation was a different thought bubble. In their thought bubble, the scene was wounded soldiers, bandaged, limping their way wherever they could, stumbling along. And I kept that cartoon on my desk to remind me, don't get too far ahead of people when you're calling them to discipleship. Because the church is both sent and wounded. Christ calls us to spread good news to the poor, to do justice, to love kindness, to create and live into the beloved community. And yet, we carry grief. We've had trauma. Fear lives right here within our own walls. And how do we live faithfully into a call to be radiant when we feel sometimes so humble, even fragile? On the Mount of Transfiguration, the disciples saw something extraordinary. For a moment, that veil between heaven and earth, between sacred and profane, it lifts, and Jesus' face dazzles. His clothes blaze. And they hear a voice from a cloud that speaks to them. And the divine message isn't their marching orders. It's very simple. Listen to him. Follow. Not conquer, not attain perfection, not seek a reward. Listen and follow. And then the disciples have to go down the mountain. The light show is over, and they have to go back into the real world. Listen to him. That command takes me to another mountain where Jesus preached. His longest and most definitive sermon was the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. And he said these words that we're focusing on. You are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. I love this pairing. Now, light gets all the publicity, right? I mean, light is like, sunrises and sunsets and blazing fires and, candles shining in the darkness. And the darkness cannot overcome the light that is shining. But I wonder if salt really does the heavy lifting when it comes to discipleship. It's hard to be the light of the world. And it's not just because of the darkness. It's because there's so much light, so much competition. We go out with our little candle, and it's neon all over the place. How are they going to see our candle? Salt. Salt comes under the radar. You don't necessarily notice it. It doesn't dazzle or impress. But where would we be without salt? Do you think much about salt? Do you notice it? Without it, your body doesn't function. Sodium chloride and chloride, they regulate the fluids of our body. They allow our nerve impulses to fire. Without salt, our muscles would not move. Our body would weaken, our systems falter. But too much. And then the body is also under stress. It has to be present in just the right amount. They didn't know all of that necessarily in the ancient world, but they knew that salt was valuable. Do you know that Roman soldiers were often paid in salt? And the word for their payment was salarium. We get the word salary. You're worth your salt. Salt was one of the most important commodities that traveled through the ancient trade routes. Roads were even called the Via Salaria, the salt roads. And these were so essential for, they didn't have refrigeration. They had to keep meat from spoiling over time. It kept life possible to stop the decay. But salt in ancient cultures had more than just economic value. In the Middle East, to eat salt with someone was to say, we're in a binded relationship. We're in covenant. We've eaten salt together. We have a commitment that we have made to one another. It was a sign of binding relationship. And we live here on the ocean. We know all about salty water. If you ever accidentally got a big mouthful in a wave, you know how salty it is. What percentage of the ocean do you think is salt? Any ideas? 2? Any other thoughts? Pretty close, about 3%. 3%. That's not very much, is it? 3% is absolutely overwhelming. And yet, just that small amount, it actually helps regulate ocean currents. It carries nutrients through the water. It makes marine life possible. Without salt, the ocean would stagnate. It needs that 3%. Interesting, researchers studying social movements have discovered something strikingly similar. Political scientist Erica Chenoweth studies how many people need to be involved in a committed, nonviolent, activist movement to bring change to an oppressive regime. And she studied places all over the world, and guess what the percentage is? 3.5. Just 0.5% more than the ocean, right? But it's really close. It's like just that amount. You don't have to have a majority to overwhelm the system. A minority dissolves into the body as a whole, changes the chemistry, like salt. It's a catalyst. In chemistry, it lowers the energy needed for a reaction, right? Salt melts ice. That's not a political metaphor. Salt does melt ice. It makes transformation possible without dominating the process. It doesn't take over, it enables. So when Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, he's not just complimenting everybody for being nice people down to earth. He's describing a vocation. Be essential. Be steady. Be that binding agent in a fractured world. Slow the corrosiveness of bitterness and decay. Enable transformation. Now we hold that up next to these images on the Mount of Transfiguration, where the disciples saw this light, this divine glory blazing. But the voice doesn't say, become dazzling. But listen to him. You are the salt of the earth. On the mountain, the light of glory is concentrated. But down in the valley, the glory diffuses, dissolves, becomes a part of life. Few of us conquer the world with our brilliance, trust me. We enter the world like salt, steadily, in the right measure, binding, preserving, enabling what is good to take root. And I think this metaphor matters because it helps us think about how we work, where we put our energy. And I like this metaphor because it helps me from feeling overwhelmed. Anybody feel overwhelmed lately? Every morning? Some days it feels like the world is on fire from 12 different directions. When I get up in the morning, I read Heather Cox Richardson's daily news summary, and I have to brace myself first, right? Before you read the news, you should like stretch a little, right? Deep breathing, prepare yourself, because, you know, I don't want to pull a muscle before I finish my coffee. I'll find my place, don't worry. So recently I was listening to a podcast by this wonderful woman named Sherry Mitchell. She's a Penobscot lawyer. She's from Maine, and she advocates for indigenous land and water rights. And in this interview, they asked her, how do you keep hope? How do you keep hope when there's so much injustice? The world seems to be falling apart. We're having backward movement on climate change. And she says, well, I have a rule. It's called the 10-10-80 rule. First, spend 10% of your time understanding what's harming the world. Read deeply. Listen carefully. Learn the roots of the problem. 10 focus percent, not doom scrolling through your news feed, right? Spend the next 10% of your time working to stop the harm. So for me this week, it meant writing Susan Collins and urging her to not fund DHS. It meant standing on the, I could never say this right, 𝐓𝐶 Bridge, is that correct? The one by Bath, right? Standing there in protest. And, you know, bridges are really cold. Your actions might be different. They might be focused on individuals through providing food to the community fridge, chopping wood for the woodchucks, delivering meals, meeting those individual needs. So that's the first 2 tens, so the 80%. Spend your time building the kind of world and envisioning what you want it to be like. This 80% shifts from fighting against things to creating new things. Creating strong local community organizations, improving lives, building relationships, helping us be resilient together. Life is better when we have land trusts, farmers markets. We teach our kids to grow things as a replacement for looking at too many screens. We need to build good local food systems. We need energy security and resiliency. That so many of the systems that are global that we rely on are falling apart and becoming less dependable. So we need to create things here at home, including, you know, art, shared spaces. We need people who are good at dialogue and conflict mediation. It all matters. And you may be thinking that this sounds a little soft in the face of our huge economic, political, the huge forces. But I want to say something clearly. We are living in a moment when our old systems are cracking and crumbling. The way we've organized our economy, our politics, even our attention They don't work. They don't work the way they once did. I don't think we're even going to be able to restore them. The future's not formed yet. I don't know about you, that makes me very anxious, fearful, uncertain. And it often makes me either want to fight everything at once or just opt out of all of it. But Jesus doesn't call us to conquer the world. He calls us to be salt. We can spend all our time naming what is broken. Some of that is necessary. We can exhaust ourselves trying to stop every form of harm. Some of that is faithful. But most of our life energy is meant for cultivation, for strengthening what feeds life, binding together what is fraying, preserving what is good, building communities that can endure. Salt doesn't dominate the meal. It disappears into it. It permeates. 3% of salt keeps the ocean alive. 3.5% can shift a regime. Then perhaps we don't need to be dazzling. We need to be steady and focused and clear and prepared. The 10-10-80 rule is simply a way of deciding how we be salt. 10% learning to tell the truth. 10% protecting what is vulnerable. 80%. That's where we plant gardens and form children and share tables and build trust and teach skills and resolve conflict and sing songs and learn how to belong to a place again. On the mountain, the disciples saw glory. In the valley, they became salt. And maybe that's our calling too. Not to try to shine brighter than the whole world, not to win every battle, but to enter the world faithfully, clearly. Slow the corrosion, strengthen what feeds life, and trusting in the midst of it that God is at work beyond the ways we can see. Amen.